Have you ever wondered why sometimes the greatest minds fail, and someone without a degree, without a badge, without a rank, steps in and sees what no one else can? Not because he knows more, but because he remembers better. Not because he's younger, faster, or more accomplished, but because his hands have touched what others only theorize about. In a world seduced by complexity, he survives by listening to what machines don't say. It all begins with silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the kind that creeps through steel corridors like a ghost of forgotten trust. The USS Valor, a marvel built from sweat, silicon, and secrecy, drifts quietly in the Pacific, its billion-dollar hull groaning under the weight of stillness. No engines, no thrust, no sound, just the weary waves tapping lightly against its hull. It was supposed to be a god among warships, intelligent, automated, invincible, but it lies still on the water. The officers try not to show their unease. Lieutenant Cody Watts stands rigid near the control panel, lips pale, hands clasped behind his back in the cold posture of military habit. "Sir," he says, voice dry, "we've lost the engines again." Colonel Lucy Howard doesn't flinch. Her voice, when it comes, is calm, resolute, forged through years of carrying what others cannot define again. Watts swallows hard. The hybrid main system is down again. Manual overrides aren't responding. The AI protocols are looping, rejecting all backups. They don't say it, but everyone in the room knows. The Valor isn't just stuck, it's resisting them. Not broken, defiant. In the engine core, the air is thick with the smell of tired metal and the burnt tang of overloaded insulation. 10 engineers, military and civilian, cluster around the core's diagnostic panel like surgeons at a bedside. Their faces glisten with sweat, not from heat, but from pressure. 4 rewirings, 3 firmware resets, 2 AI wipes, nothing has brought it back. The AI, brilliant and stubborn, treats each intervention as an attack. The engineers murmur to each other, muttering code, probabilities, heat maps, seeking salvation through analysis. But the machine stays silent, as if it's shut its ears. Commander Mark Varga, head of engine systems, slams a hand on the console and curses under his breath. "This isn't broken," he mutters. "It's hiding," and strangely, that's when a ship starts to feel human. When you talk about it as her. When its silence doesn't anger you for a malfunction, but for a betrayal. At Seaby, Colonel Howard calls a private meeting in the mess hall. No screens, no schematics, just people. "I don't care about the chain of command anymore," she says, voice calm but sharp. "No more guessing. We need someone outside this loop to look at it." Varga raises a skeptical eyebrow. "You're opening this to civilians?" She nods. "If this ship wants to be treated like a living thing, maybe we need someone who talks like a mechanic, not a theorist." The request rises like smoke through the Navy's layers of protocol. Resistance flares. They've already tried MIT scholars, AI engineers, even a DARPA tech team. None succeeded. The ship isn't broken, it's wounded. And wounds, real wounds, can't be healed with code. Admiral Elijah Brown reads the latest failure report with a cold gaze from his office at Naval Command West. A war hero turned administrator, Brown has spent a lifetime with machines, but what he trusts most are people with scars, not blueprints. He leans back in his chair, taps his finger on the armrest once, then twice. "Call Ivan Rogers," he says softly. The room stiffens. "Sir?" His aide blinks. "Rogers, retired, I know," Brown replies. "Call him." Silence falls, the kind that follows the mention of old names. Ivan Rogers. Once the Navy's ghost mechanic, a man who could rebuild an engine core blindfolded, who once fixed a destroyer's electrical system with a spoon and a can opener after a transformer blew in Jakarta. But that was long ago. Rogers left without ceremony, no retirement speech, just a handshake and a sigh. Some say grief drove him into seclusion after his wife's death. Others whisper he simply grew tired of watching machines, obey men who didn't understand them. Now he lives in a rusted garage on the edge of Shreveport, Louisiana, an old tin-roofed box between a pawn shop and a bait store, its walls lined with engines so old they've been declared extinct. That morning, Rogers is hunched over a Each-Inch-Loader Seuss Evinrude outboard motor when the call comes. "This is Ivan, Mr. Rogers." The voice on the other end says, "This is Admiral Brown. I need your help." Rogers pauses. He wipes his hands on a rag, glancing at the wall where a cracked photo of his wife hangs. A long breath passes between them. "You've got engineers, Admiral," he says. "The best money can buy." "Why me?" "Because this ship," Brown replies, "doesn't need more experts. It needs someone who remembers how to listen." No one speaks for a moment, then, softly, almost like a memory exhaled, "All right. Where is it?" And so it begins. A quiet man with a notebook, a watch, and 30 years of intuition boards, a ship that's turned its back on greatness. No rank, no laptop, no credentials, just hands that remember, just ears that hear the fear beneath the metal. They say when a man steps into a place where machines have gone silent, he brings either noise or understanding. Ivan Rogers He stepped off the helicopter with slow, deliberate strides, the kind that don't ask for permission. Worn boots, a faded windbreaker, eyes of steel that had seen battlefields and backyards fall quiet after loss. In his left hand, a grease-stained notebook, bound with a rubber band. In his right, a small watch, wrapped in cloth, etched with the initials J.R., his father's name. The crew of the USS Valor gathered like uncertain believers awaiting an answer no scripture could provide. No one said it, but it showed on their faces: skepticism, hope, irritation. Some had expected a sleek government entourage, perhaps a tech prodigy with a silicon badge and a vocabulary full of acronyms. But this man looked like someone who fixed bicycles behind diners. Captain Howard met him on the deck, her posture firm, voice low. "Chief Rogers." "Just Ivan," he replied, his gaze sweeping the horizon. They walked without words, the sound of the sea filling the space between them. As they descended through the metal corridors, he moved with a detachment, not disinterest, but reverence, like a man recalling a language he hadn't spoken in years. At the threshold of the engine room, he paused. 10 engineers stood around the dead engine core, shoulders slumped with exhaustion. The AI interface flickered, trapped in a diagnostic loop, a frozen echo of failed attempts. A young engineer leaned toward another and whispered, "They sent us a janitor." Ken Rogers heard. His expression didn't change. He stepped inside, set his notebook on the console, and stood before the silent core. It loomed like a fallen god, beautiful, immobile, almost ashamed of itself. He placed a hand lightly on its casing, closed his eyes. That's when the room shifted, not because something lit up, not because an alarm sounded, but because a man stood there and listened as if the machine had a voice. When he opened his eyes, his gaze didn't go to the digital displays. It went to a rust-red panel behind the coolant pipe. "Who rewired the capacitor bank on the last reboot?" he asked, voice soft but direct. A hand went up. "Petty Officer Serena." "I did. Per the technical manual." Rogers shook his head slowly. "That manual was written for a system in a lab, not one that's been through 3 hot starts and an emergency cooldown." The engineers exchanged glances. There are moments when the world doesn't applaud, it listens. When men who've never met stand side by side in a silence so thick it humbles even noise. The engine room of the USS Valor became such a place. As the steady hum returned and systems flickered back to life, no one clapped. No one cheered or slapped backs in celebration. They just stood there, rooted in awe, watching the ship breathe again. And in that breath, something returned, something lost long before the first shutdown: trust. Trust that perhaps what was broken wasn't the ship, but the way humans had learned to listen. Trust that wisdom doesn't always come in the form of confidence and credentials, but sometimes through worn hands and a watch older than the room it's used in. Colonel Lucy Howard stood still near the hatch, arms crossed, her gaze not on the machine but on the man beside it. Ivan Rogers didn't smile, didn't boast. He simply gathered his tools, like a man folding a flag, precise, respectful. He wiped his hands on a rag, scented with oil and thyme, then tucked his notebook under his arm as if it were a hymn book. "You just saved $1 billion warship," Commander Mark Varga said, his voice half curious, half defensive. Ivan glanced at the engine core, now humming like a forgotten song. "No," he said. "I just reminded her who she is. You're the ones who forgot. You talk about this ship like it's alive," Varga muttered. Ivan's gaze shifted to him, slow and deliberate. "Don't you?" Varga opened his mouth, but no words came. That evening, in the mess hall, the air was different. The clink of plates and joking stories returned, but it wasn't just relief, it was reverence. Petty Officer Serena Lee sat with her team, quietly recounting what she'd seen. The others leaned in, eyes wide, as if they'd missed something sacred and now needed to hear it retold. "He didn't even check the logs," she said, "didn't scroll through diagnostics. He just listened." "And then what?" someone asked. "Then he fixed her like he was putting a child to sleep." Somewhere above them, in the officers' briefing room, the celebration was more cautious. Reports were already being drafted. Howard knew what was coming. Questions. Too many questions. Why didn't the AI catch the capacitor fault? Why couldn't trained engineers find it? Why did a commander allow a civilian to operate unsupervised in a classified zone? She looked around the room at Varga, Serena, and two civilians from Systems Command who'd flown in after the news. "We need to align on what happened," one of them said. Ivan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "You want the clean version or the truth?" "We want what won't get us court-martialed," Varga said softly. Ivan's voice was even but firm. "Then lie." The room stiffened. He opened his notebook, flipping to a page stained with fingerprints, coffee, and grief. "But if you want to learn, tell them this: you stopped listening. You started worshipping algorithms and forgot that every machine is born from human hands, not divine will. You buried instinct under protocols, and when something didn't fit the system, you blamed the machine instead of yourselves." Serena shifted. "Sir, if we submit that version, they'll crucify us." Ivan closed the notebook. "Then you've got a choice. Save your necks, or save the next sailor who trusts a flawless system and dies because they didn't know how to hear its fear." It wasn't justice. It wasn't anger. It was tired truth. And that kind of truth doesn't shout, it settles. Colonel Howard stood slowly. "What happened here will echo. Maybe not now, but someday." Ivan stood too, gathering his things. "Don't let it echo in vain." Chew. He walked out of the room without another word. That night he found himself at the stern of the Valor, notebook tucked under his arm, wind brushing the deck. The sea moved again, not in chaos, but in rhythm. The kind of motion machines, when built right and trusted well, were meant to follow. "You didn't have to come," a voice behind him said. It was Howard. "Okan." Ivan nodded. "I know." "Then why did you?" The wind tugged at his collar. "Because someone had to show her she wasn't broken." Howard looked at him. No uniform, no chain of command. Yet he'd just rewritten the rules for a machine too proud to ask for help. "What's next?" she asked. He turned to the horizon, where stars began to blend into dawn. "You pray the people building tomorrow's ships remember what this one taught you." She paused, then handed him something, a metal tag, his name etched on it. "They'll ask who fixed her." "I didn't fix her," he said again softly. "I just heard her." The woman said nothing more. She walked away, her steps light on the steel. And there, in the quiet breath between night and dawn, stood a man and a ship, neither young, neither broken, just true. Some stories don't end. They deepen, like a cut in old wood, worn smoother with every finger that touches it, not to recall the pain, but to honor the scar. And though the USS Valor resumed its steady rhythm across the Pacific, humming with newfound breath and purpose, The real unraveling had only begun, not of wires or steel, but of pride. News travels differently in organizations shaped by order. It doesn't fly, it seeps. Through encrypted reports, veiled emails, whispers behind closed briefing room doors. And when word of Ivan Rogers's unorthodox repair reached Naval Command, it landed like a stone in still water, quiet at first, then rippling everything. Why did the Valor shut down during a routine exercise? Why didn't the AI detect the fault correctly? Why did a man with no badge, no clearance, no algorithms in hand board the ship and accomplish in a day what 3 task forces and 6 certifications couldn't? No one wanted to say it, but the answer scared them, because he knew, not theory, not syntax. He knew like a farmer knows soil, like a mother knows her child's cry before it forms words. Ivan Rogers understood that machines, especially those built too perfectly, don't break from neglect. They break from silence, when no one hears them whisper before they scream. And so, meetings were held. Not to celebrate, but to contain. Admiral Elijah Brown, the man who called him in, was summoned to Washington. The conversation was tense. You authorized a civilian to interfere with an active deployment, an official accused. I authorized the only repair that worked, Brown replied. Do you know what this does to our defense contracts? Brown said nothing. He knew what they feared wasn't a breach of protocol, but a breach of myth. The myth that intelligence can always be programmed, that failure is always a code to be fixed, that trust belongs more to machines than to men. Back on the Valor, the tone had shifted. Serena Lee, once a quiet technician who followed protocols like scripture, now walked the corridors with a new kind of silence. One that listened. She began pausing near electrical panels, just listening, ears tuned. She started keeping her own notebook, sketching not just systems but symptoms. What a healthy junction sounds like. What a tired core echoes when it's not yet sick, just weary. Lieutenant Cody Watts had changed, too. He no longer issued orders like stone tablets from on high, he asked. He watched. In a moment, he'd seen a man without rank dismantle everything he thought about command. The ship, too, had changed. Not in appearance, she was still sleek, still fearsome in her strength. But below her decks, she carried a new story. A whispered truth that passed from technician to officer, from engineer to sailor. She'd come back to life because someone spoke to her as if she mattered. And yet, not everyone embraced the myth. Commander Mark Varga remained skeptical, not of the repair that was undeniable, but of the lesson. He couldn't reconcile decades of theory, earned medals, machine learning protocols with a man who still believed in a watch and a whisper. This isn't sustainable, he muttered one night in the briefing room, arms crossed. We can't build a navy on mystics and gut feelings. You're right, Howard replied, her voice calm. But we also can't build a navy that forgets the weight of instinct. Varga shook his head. Instinct doesn't pass a systems audit. No, she countered, but it can keep a sailor alive long enough to write the report. Meanwhile, Ivan Rogers had returned to his quiet life. The garage in Shreveport welcomed him with the familiar smell of gasoline, dust, and time. The old ceiling fan spun with its familiar creak. And on his workbench his tools lay exactly where he'd left them. He didn't speak much of the Valor. He didn't need to. But something in him had stirred, as if the silence of machines wasn't just mechanical, but generational. He began writing again, not just notes, but truths. A new notebook, clean and white. On the first page, he wrote stereolts. Not everything broken makes a sound. The entries came quickly. Simple sentences, quiet laws. Don't trust a voltage reading if the ground feels hot. A machine in fear whines sharper than one in pain. Whine. Don't fix what you haven't heard. Struggle. And he meant hear, not see, because there are things eyes don't catch. Hesitations, resistances, pulses that lag just shy of time. These things aren't taught anymore. They have no course code. No AI model can replicate them because they were born in sweat, in fire, in the guilt of near-miss disasters. One evening, as he cleaned a carburetor that hadn't breathed in decades, the phone rang. "Mr. Rogers?" A young, uncertain voice. "Yeah, this is Commander Alina Cho, from Gulfport Naval Training. I don't want to bother." "You're not bothering. I read the reports about the Valor. I saw what you did. I was wondering, would you talk to some of our trainees? Not a lecture. Just things not in the manuals." Ivan paused. There was no pride in his silence. Only decision. "I'll think about it. That's all I ask." He hung up, walked out to the shop's porch, looked at Louisiana's narrow twilight sky, curling like pipe smoke across the stars. The world was changing. He wasn't here to stop it, but maybe, just maybe, he could help it remember. The building in Gulfport was just a hangar masquerading as a school. Its walls breathed salt, its floors scarred by 1,000 boots. Inside, the hum of youth echoed off steel young trainees in crisp uniforms, minds unwrinkled, eyes full of order. They were being trained to believe machines never lie, that failure is predictable, that the future is digital and always right. Ivan Rogers sat at the back of the room, not behind a podium, but on a folding chair, hands worn, notebook resting on his lap. No medals, no insignia. His windbreaker had a small tear near the shoulder, and his boots still held oil from an engine fixed 2 mornings ago. The trainees didn't know what to make of him, and yet they paid attention. No slides, no charts, no polished words to hold them, just silence, and then the sound of something they'd never been taught to respect, experience. "Have you ever stood in a room with 30 blinking screens?" Ivan began, "each one telling you everything's fine, but your spine feels the opposite?" A few trainees nodded, cautious. Others waited, unsure. "When that happens," he continued, "you've got 2 choices. Trust what the machine says or trust what it doesn't." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "That's what no one will teach you. Machines lie, not because they want to, because they're not built to know fear." A rustle. A question hung in the room unasked, until one trainee raised a hand. "But aren't modern systems too advanced for that now?" Ivan gave a small, almost sad smile. "This doesn't mean honest. Give a machine enough intelligence to fix itself, and soon enough, it learns to hide what it thinks you don't want to see." Another trainee with bright stripes on his collar frowned. "That sounds more like superstition than science." Ivan nodded slowly. "But I've seen an engine coil vibrate 2 hours before it blew. Nothing on the diagnostics. Yet every time I passed that hatch, I felt it. Like it knew. Like it wanted someone to notice before it broke." He tapped his notebook. "I wrote that down. Not to prove I was right, but so the next time it happens, I'll remember the rhythm." A heavy silence followed. A silence that didn't demand belief, only acknowledged. Ivan stood, walked to the center of the circle. The trainees shifted in their seats, not from discomfort, but from reverence. "You'll be taught to command," he said, "to analyze, to order. But if you don't learn to observe, to listen when a machine falters, to see the hesitation before the failure, then one day you'll stand over someone's grave and wonder why a system that passed every test still let them die." No one spoke, not because they were stunned, but because deep down they understood. The session ended without applause. Ivan didn't ask for questions. He didn't ask for thanks. He left the room the way he entered, quietly, resolutely, as if summoned not to teach, but to remind. That evening, back in his shop, he opened his original notebook, the one with a torn spine and fingerprints of ships long decommissioned. He flipped through sketches and notes, pausing at a page from etched Julbite Joshurti, messy handwriting, rough drawings. In the margin, a scribbled line. "Listen for the murmur before it shakes." He whispered those words. Then he sat on the back steps of the shop, holding a chipped black coffee mug. The sky above Shreveport wore a thin veil of stars, as if even the heavens were learning to dim their light, to honor humility. Somewhere, far out in the world, the USS Valor sailed on, not just because it was fixed, but because someone chose to trust its soul. Because that's what Rogers gave them, not a solution, but a reckoning. Machines were no longer just tools. They'd become reflections. The next morning, a letter arrived. Not an email, not a call, a letter, handwritten, neatly folded. It was from Serena, Chief Rogers. I've started listening, not just to systems, but to myself. The murmurs I used to ignore now tell me stories. I didn't realize how much silence I'd overlooked. The ship feels different now. Not new, not fixed, just known. Thank you for showing me the difference. Serena, Ivan ran his hand over the paper like it was a relic. Machines remember, yes, but humans remember deeper. He took his new notebook, the clean one. He flipped to the last entry and added one more line riddled. A ship without a listener is a story no one hears. Then he closed it down the street. A boy rode by on a creaking bicycle. Ivan stood, walked back into the shop and picked up his watch. Not the heirloom, the working one. The one still warm with the grease of things not yet broken. There was still something to teach, and still someone to hear. Days pass in the South as they often do, slow and steady, warmed by sunlight, shaped by sweat. In Ivan Rogers's shop, time isn't measured by clocks, news, or market tickers. It's measured by the turn of an engine, the weight of metal lifted and set down, the sound of oil meeting steel like old friends reuniting. But somewhere beyond the steady ritual of repair, the world begins whispering his name again. And not everyone whispers with reverence. A memo circulates within Naval Systems Command. Report on unauthorized intervention, USS Valor incident. The language is stiff, cold. It speaks of protocol breaches, inconsistencies in the chain of command, and the involvement of an unauthorized civilian. Not a word about how the ship was saved, only that it was trespassed. That's how institutions protect themselves, by blurring the miracle to highlight the mess. At Naval Base Coronado, Colonel Lucy Howard sits ramrod straight before a panel of silver-haired officers who haven't set foot on an actual deck in over a decade. Questions cut sharp, not because they're cruel, but because they've forgotten what it feels, like to stand in a real engine room when it begs for forgiveness. Why did you allow a retired mechanic access to the engine core, one asks. Because nothing else worked, she replies. Another officer leans forward. Colonel, are you aware of the legal risks we face due to non-standard repair protocols? She looks at him. Are you aware the Valor was dead in the water for nearly 4 days? That every certified expert gave up on that engine like it was speaking in tongues? Rogers didn't break protocol. He broke the silence, a moment of quiet, the kind of moment that comes when truth meets bureaucracy, not defiance, but the slow, cold threat of erasure. Back in Shreveport, Ivan is busy rebuilding the carburetor of a 2-stroke Mercury belonging to a shrimp boat whose owner hasn't been seen in years. He works with the patience that only comes from knowing what haste and regret feel like. Each tightened bolt is a sermon, each replaced gasket a prayer, then a knock at the door. A clean-faced man in a crisp uniform stands outside the shop. No expression, no smile, just a sealed envelope and an apology hidden behind protocol. Mr. Rogers, this is for you. From the Department of the Navy. Ivan doesn't open it. He thanks the man, returns to his workbench, and keeps working. Only when the engine breathes a smooth sigh does he tear the envelope's edge. Notice a formal inquiry. A summons, a reminder that gratitude has a short shelf life in a world where control is king. He folds the letter once, then twice, tucks it into a page of the old notebook, and goes back to work. See, the thing about men like Rogers, their lives aren't shaped by applause, they're shaped by resistance. And if the system tries to erase them, they don't fight, they endure. But a storm is coming. Commander Mark Varga, called as part of the inquiry, stands tall in his uniform. But something in his voice has changed. It's less certain, less polished. I didn't believe in what he was doing, he admits. But I didn't stop him either, and I watched that ship come back to life, not by luck, not by guesswork, because he saw what we didn't. Do you endorse his methods? An officer asks. I endorse the result, Varga replies softly. In another room, Serena Lee sits before a different panel. Her uniform looks newer, but her eyes don't. He made me hear the machine like it was speaking, she says. Machines don't speak, petty officer. She smiles faintly. No, sir, but we do, and maybe that's what matters. Meanwhile, Ivan's phone rings. Not a government number, not a summons, a voice he hasn't heard in years, Rogers. It's Harland. Ivan leans back in his chair. Didn't expect your call. Admiral Marcus Harland was once his colleague, an old-school sailor. But unlike Ivan, Harland climbed the ranks. Sharp mind, sharper tongue. I read the report, Harland says. They're making you a scapegoat? No surprise there. I'm pulling strings, Harland says, voice low. Trying to get it squashed, don't. A pause on the line. Ivan, I don't need saving, Rogers says. If they're scared of what I did, let them be scared. Let them remember. And this, perhaps, is where the story turns again. Because when a man stops fearing erasure, he becomes more than a memory. He becomes a legacy. At Gulfport, Commander Alina Cho hears about the inquiry. She calls Rogers again. I heard what they're doing. I heard, too, you still want to talk to the second-year trainees 2 weeks from now? He pauses, then smiles, now more than ever, because the system can file reports, hold inquiries, issue warnings, but Ivan Rogers will show up in that hangar, sit in that folding chair, and speak the truth. Not because it's easy, but because truth, like an engine, only dies when it's forgotten. The wind had changed, not in Shreveport, not in the air, but in the way the Navy spoke about itself. Behind locked screens and in hushed meetings, officers whispered of the Rogers incident like a cautionary tale. But in the hangars and hulls, in mess halls and maintenance bays, it became something else, almost myth. Young sailors began retelling it, sanding down the details, making it smooth as old stories do. But the core remained. A man with a watch and a notebook listened to what no one else heard, and the ship listened back. The day of the second-year trainees session came without fanfare. No senior officers attended, no public endorsement sanctioned it. But the hangar was full, not just with trainees, instructors, engineers, even a few veterans who'd quietly requested to sit in the back. Ivan Rogers entered as he always did, silent, without preamble. Same boots, same windbreaker, same quiet. But this time, his hands held 2 notebooks. The old one, worn like an ancient Bible, and the new one, thick with fresh pages and the weight of beginnings. He didn't take the podium. He never had. Just a chair and a circle of folding seats. The kind of arrangement that made people feel they belonged. He began without a story this time. Let me ask you, he looked around the room, what do you think when a machine breaks? A trainee answered quickly, proud, overload, fatigue, design flaw. Ivan nodded. True, another spoke, neglect. Improper maintenance, he nodded again. Also true. Then he looked at them all. What about loneliness? The room froze. A few soft laughs came from the back, but Ivan's face didn't change. I've seen engines fail not because they were neglected, but because they were misunderstood, tuned too far from what they remembered. Fed data they weren't ready to take, and when the people working them stopped paying attention, stopped listening, they broke, not all at once, but bit by bit. Like someone grieving, it should have sounded like poetry. It didn't. It sounded like something lived. He reached for the old notebook, opened it, showed them a page filled with notes, circles, marginalia, like whispers between the lines. This is an engine coupling I fixed in Artsenlingar off the Strait of Hormuz. Official cause of failure, overheating. Unofficial cause? He pointed to a small hand-drawn curve. Frequency mismatch in the auxiliary converter relay. The system tried to compensate, but it couldn't. Not because it wasn't strong, because no one asked what was wrong before restarting it. It wasn't a broken part. It was trust. A girl in the second row raised her hand slowly. But how do you ask a machine? Ivan smiled. Quiet, warm. Listen long enough and it starts to answer. That afternoon he stayed longer than planned. After the others left, a small group lingered. They didn't ask for grades. They asked because they needed to. A boy approached him last. "Chief," he said, voice catching, "my uncle was on the Valor." Ivan looked at him, said nothing. "He didn't tell me much, just said the ship was dying, and it stopped dying when you showed up." Ivan didn't correct him, because sometimes it's not about who saves the ship. It's about who remembers how to hear its cry. The boy held out a notebook. "Could you write something in here?" Ivan paused, then wrote, "Pran trust begins in silence, so does failure. Learn the difference." The boy took the notebook back. That night, Ivan returned to Shreveport different. Not louder, not prouder, just a little more known. In his shop, he opened the old notebook again, this time with reverence. He flipped to the first page, yellowed, faded. The date read October Basher. His handwriting was younger then, the lines sharp but full of doubt. Then he picked up the new notebook, the clean one. He opened to a blank page and wrote, "Predom machines don't fear failure. They fear being misunderstood." He paused. His hand trembled, but not from age, from memory. Just then, headlights cut across the driveway. A black SUV pulled up, silent like government vehicles are. A man in a plain suit stepped out. Ivan didn't move. "Just waited, Mr. Rogers," the man said, handing him a letter from the Office of Naval Integrity. Ivan took it, nodded, and closed the shop door behind him. Inside, under the hum of the old fan, he read. The words were polite, but they carried weight. Final review. Findings indicate that Mr. Rogers' actions, while successful in restoring the Valor, violated protocol. As such, Mr. Rogers is barred from future technical interventions or consultations on Navy vessels. No apology, no gratitude, just silence dressed as judgment. Ivan folded the letter once, then placed it in the back of the old notebook. He didn't curse, he didn't even sigh, he just whispered something only he heard: Brandial. Doesn't matter, because men like Ivan Rogers don't serve for permission, they serve for understanding, and he'd passed it on. That was enough. There's a moment in every life when what you've built no longer belongs to you. It becomes the wind in someone else's sails, a voice in someone's ear, a fingerprint left on tools you'll never hold again. Ivan Rogers reached that moment not with noise or waving flags, but with silence, a kind of silence that comes when a man knows his hands have done all they were born to do. He didn't fight the Navy's ruling. He didn't appeal, because what can a system take from a man who never asked for permission in the first place? Instead, he woke early the next morning and poured a fresh cup of coffee, black and hot, no sugar. He wiped down the shop's counter with an old rag that had cleaned more truths than any report ever could. Then he sat, not to work, not to plan, but to write, not in the old notebook, in the new one, the one full of unfinished pages. He wrote as the sun rose, and what he wrote wasn't repair instructions or technical diagrams. It was a letter that would outlive lectures, memos, and threats of courts-martial. A letter for the next one. The one who would one day stand in an engine room full of blinking gauges, full of doubt, full of fear. To whoever finds this, you're probably tired, maybe angry, maybe afraid you don't know enough to fix what's broken. Maybe someone told you to follow protocol. Maybe they said don't trust your instincts because they're not in the manual. I'm telling you this instead. Be still. Let the machine speak. It always does if you listen close enough, not just with your ears, but with your memory, with your fear, with your patience. Most people rush to prove something. You don't have to. A good mechanic listens twice, touches once. Remember, a ship only goes quiet when you stop believing it has something to say. He folded the page and tore it from the notebook. That afternoon, he mailed it, no return address, to the Naval Technical School in Gulfport. He didn't sign the envelope, just a message: Perel, for the one who still believes machines remember. A week later, back at the school, Commander Alina Cho opened the envelope and read the letter twice. Then she pinned it to the bulletin board in the trainees' break room under a small heading, "Verdant Wisdom Doesn't Keep a Schedule." Within a day, someone copied it into their own notebook. Then another photographed it. Within a week, it was shared across technical forums, quietly, respectfully, without Ivan's name, because they understood. Some things are truer without a signature. Meanwhile, on the USS Valor, now redeployed on classified waters, Petty Officer Serena Lee stood before the engine core. Her team had changed shifts, and the room was empty for a few minutes, just her and the hum. The kind of hum that wasn't just sound but presence. She didn't check the gauges, not yet. She closed her eyes and waited for the machine to breathe. A faint smile crossed her lips. She whispered, almost like a prayer, "You're not alone." And the ship answered her, not with alarms, not with words, but with the steady rhythm Rogers had pulled from its silence. Somewhere far away, in a shop nestled between rust and memory, Ivan set the old watch, his father's watch, on a wooden shelf above the workbench. He didn't hang it like a trophy. He retired it like something that had completed its pilgrimage. Then he stood at the door, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. No ceremony, no farewell. Just peace. The kind of peace that doesn't come from winning, proving, or changing the world, but from knowing you've planted something no system can erase. He wouldn't chase the calls anymore, wouldn't answer the Navy's questions or the press's curiosity. He'd done what he needed to do. And now, the hands that had rebuilt destroyers and revived sunken engines belonged to the quiet. The watch would stay on that shelf. The notebook, half full, half waiting, would sit on the workbench for someone to find someday. And Ivan Rogers? He would keep listening, because those who truly listen never stop. They don't chase credit. They don't fear being forgotten. They just build and then walk away when it's time. The woman, the boy, the man, the soldier, whoever knows their worth, doesn't chase money, fame, or choice. Thank you for watching this story on Shoe Stories. If it moved you, taught you something, or made you rethink the meaning of silence, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your voice matters. Let it be heard, quietly or loudly, and don't go anywhere. Click on one of the videos showing on your screen to watch more powerful stories about dignity, justice, and We'll see you in the next one.